Ladies and gentlemen, we'll make a start. People are still creeping in, but in the interest of Swiss timing, I suggest we kick things off. First of all, thank you for being here. It's such an important panel. Since this morning's opening, we've heard a lot about creating shared value. Hopefully through this panel, we can actually take you through what that may actually look like. We've got a fantastic group of panelists here. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. I tend to either promote them or demote them by mistake, so it's much better if they introduce themselves, and it'll probably be a lot shorter. We were having a discussion before kicking off the session that we're a little concerned by the level of interest. You all look a bit, how should I say, scary. Lucky for us private sector folk, the exits are quite close. So I'll make a judge of what the mood is in the room. But without further ado, I'll kick things off. As a matter of just introductions, firstly, I'm Oz Ozturk. I'm a partner from PricewaterhouseCoopers from the consulting group. I've been working with the UNISDR for over a year on the program specifically to engage the private sector around the topic of disaster risk reduction and how some of the world's largest organisations actually perceive disaster risk and how they create a business strategy to deal with that. With that, I'll hand it over to Rudi, and Rudi can...
Thank you, Oz. My name is Rudi Garcia. I represent Citigroup. I am the managing director and global head of a couple of things dealing with business risk management, particular business continuity, and all the aspects that it takes for us to ensure that our business continues to operate during a disruption, no matter what type of disruption there is. I am also responsible for crisis management as far as from our business sector. So as you can imagine, we operate in 100 countries. There's always something going on, and there's a number of things that we have to interact with, both public sector as well as our own internal companies and the people that we're dependent, so our suppliers and our chain structure. The other responsibilities that I have for the firm are supplier risk management, because we do look at our dependencies and our relationships with our suppliers. And finally, records management, obviously the vital records that we are generating during the course of a day of business, and how do we protect that and ensure that they're available should we have a business disruption. Thanks, Rudi.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Lilian Blumen. I'm the Minister of Development Aid and International Trade of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a country, as you know, in a delta. Large parts of our country are below sea level. So we are very familiar with the concept of resilience, and we had a lot of experience in coming up with effective strategies to deal with the risks. We have also been able to share that expertise outside of our country. As a development minister, I'm also intending to use risk assessments in all the development investments that we are doing. I come from the NGO community, and in one of my past capacities, I brought together the development NGOs in the Netherlands and the environmental NGOs in the Netherlands to work on issues of climate change and disaster risk reduction. And I thought I need to take that to the next level and engage myself with the private sector. So here I am. And I will speak to you in a minute about how we as Dutch public sector have been working with the private sector in disaster risk reduction in our own country, but also in other countries, engaging in public-private partnerships.
Hello, my name is Jan Sturluson. I'm a partner from PwC and based in Sweden. I am the global leader for government and public services, which includes a lot of huge international organizations such as UN, EU, World Bank, NATO, and so on and so forth. I'm also a member of World Economic Forum, the Global Agenda Council of Future of International Governance, and I work a lot with different clients on different levels, from central government to local level. But it's also very much about interfaces. I would say interface management, in-between space leadership. I think it's very important to both reduce risk, but also to create opportunities, which means how do we redesign the innovation ecosystem? That's some learnings I would like to come back to later on.
My name is Christian Fruttiger. I'm the Deputy Head of Public Affairs at Nestle, big multinational food and beverage company. Like the Minister, I actually come from the NGO sector.
We go places.
And I even went one step further, actually joining a company. I come from the relief and development sector, last working for the International Committee of the Red Cross for 13 years. Joined Nestle a few years ago, and at Nestle I'm in charge of issue management. On the panel before, you had our head of group risk who looks at things before they go wrong. I am the guy with whom things end up when they go wrong. So this is what I do at Nestle. We have a concept which we call creating shared value, which has also the title of this session. It's the firm belief of the company that a company can only be successful in the long term, business-wise, and for its shareholders, is if it at the same time creates value for society wherever it is active. And this at all levels of the value chain. And this, by the way, why I joined Nestle, and I'm working with the company now.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Roscoe. I'm head of sustainability at ABB. We're an engineering company, mainly into large electrical infrastructure and automation for industries. I joined the company in 2001. My responsibilities include health, safety, environment, crisis management. So similar to Christian, when things go wrong in the risk management area, then it falls to me to see what we can make of them. An additional responsibility is security. And to give you an idea of scope, we're present in 100 countries, 145,000 employees, and possibly as many contractors in any one day. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. As you can see, we've got a great team up here, and hopefully we'll have some active Q&A sessions at the end of at the panel. I'd like to set some expectations. The way we're going to run, or the format of this session will be, I'm going to talk about shared value and some of the findings of the PwC report, specifically how the private sector view disaster risk management. From there, I'll ask each of the panelists to give their views and how their organizations actually deal with this topic, and hopefully with some examples. And then we'll go into a panelist Q&A session, and then I'll open to the floor. Okay. I should also note Miss Lilian Blumen has a hard stop at 6 p.m. It's not because she's not interested or she's upset with the forum when she leaves at 6, so I just want to set that expectation. So she'll slowly slink away without disrupting anyone. Okay. Okay. Now, we've got a lot of people in the room. How many of you have actually read the GAR report, or maybe the abridged version? Great, okay. So those of you who put your hand up should know that on page 238, there is a concept of what creating shared value means. So let me set the scene for you. First of all, creating shared value means moving away from something like business continuity planning, some you would know as BCP, to more of a disaster management strategy. So making investment decisions, creating an org structure which supports that. Can we close those doors? No? So looking at disaster management strategy rather than just BCP. Looking at resilience as a business opportunity rather than just pure risk management and a defensive strategy. Incorporating it within the national agendas of governments, but also involving businesses locally and globally. Having a framework which drives investment decisions. So not just having some visibility around the metrics, the real price of risk, and open source models. And then finally, disclosure of the balance sheet. So what is the exposure of the private sector or the entity? What is the valuation around that? So they're the 5 major concepts, as defined within the GAR with respect to creating shared value. Okay, it may not be perfect, but that's kind of the framework we're working with. Now, why is this important? You've heard all this morning, there's some very strong context to this. The economic value from natural disasters is rising quite dramatically. That's a lot due to the global interdependencies we have. Those interdependencies actually create or amplify the resulting impact on all levels, whether it be financial, humanitarian, economically. It's not just a developing world issue. I think if we look back 5 or 10 years ago, this was seen as a emerging economy or developing world issue. It's not. It impacts everyone, all of us. Unfortunately, the growth that we've seen has actually outpaced the resilience practices that need to be put in place. So there's a misalignment in values. And the long-term impacts are actually becoming better understood. So today, we have a better understanding of the societal and economic impacts, such as displaced communities and long-term unemployment, the erosion of long-term GDP, especially in the smaller economies. It accelerates such global issues as food security. And then finally, it ultimately impacts government structures, whether we like it or not. So it's quite interweaved and interrelated. There are some other important things to take into account. Not creating a resilient environment solidifies such factors as long-term poverty. In those emerging and developing economies, not having a resilient organisation or a workforce actually even promotes those aspects. So there is a huge opportunity cost involved with that investment. The dollars that are going into reducing poverty are actually being negated by less resilient structures that are being put in place. So we need to take that context into account. What was the initiative, the PwC UNISDR initiative? Well, it involved 15 global organisations. In the report it says 14. It actually doesn't highlight that PwC was also one of them. We're 190,000 people growing every day in 158 offices. Looking at the mirror was also difficult, but we also came out with some learnings. To give you some extent to the scale, it's only 15 organisations, but that's over 1 trillion in revenue and over several million in employees. So just those 15 organisations have a global impact. So that sends a strong message. So it included the likes of Citigroup, ABB, Nestle, the Hindustan Construction Group, Arup, British Gas, Hitachi, NTT, obviously both from Japan, the Intercon Group, and obviously Walmart. So some very, very big names. Why do we go to such large organisations? Well, first of all, they're a cross-section of industries, a great mix of products and services. They have global reach, but they're also quite active in their local communities. So they're active at every level. One important factor is to realise is to engage the private sector, you need to go in with an extended hand, an environment of trust. At no point did we go in to assess how well or how badly these organisations were doing. And that's a great learning. Like, we wanted to take the best practices rather than assess what they're not doing so well. We created a common framework. Why? Because we needed a common language, a taxonomy, The perception of risk across this table and within this room is very different. Everyone you talk to has a different value. If I come back to creating shared value, we all have a different concept of that. So we needed to have a common ground of discussion. And we also wanted to understand who was doing well in some area and who was doing well in others. And we found across this whole cross-section of organisations, everyone had a different currency. They had a special expertise that they could bring to the table to share within themselves, but also with the greater community. And in terms of scope, we looked at quite a holistic structure, so human, environmental, financial, operational, and most importantly, reputational. And then we looked at the underlying enablers, so the people, the organisation structure, the skill set of their staff, their supply chains, the technology they adopted, and then finally how these concepts were incorporated within their business strategy. I'll conclude with some of the findings and then I'll open up to the panel. There are really 4 major findings that we found. First of all, disaster risk management and incorporating it into the board strategy was a major priority within all of these organisations. And I would say, with many other organisations. So it is actually at the forefront of the CEO's mind, the chairman's mind, the COO's mind. We also found, though, a lot of that mindset had shifted after I would say a quick succession of incidents, so in the last 10 years. So post-September 11, Katrina, the 2004 Indian Ocean event, earthquake and tsunami, obviously Superstorm Sandy and Fukushima. What did we find that these organisations do really well? First of all, they included expert advice from many different fields. So I think Aris Papadopoulos made a great comment earlier with the private sector advisory group that you need to involve real experts, and you need many of them, not just a myopic view. They learnt from their experiences and shared those experiences within their organisations. They codified those experiences, not just the response, but the type of incidents, how to prepare for them, how to create local relationships with communities. They put in place facilities so their organisations could run in a remote access way. So I'm not talking about you going home and accessing your email, every night, or if you're a bit stressed on the weekends. This is more about what happens to our organisation if it can't operate for a week, 2 weeks, a month. It creates some fundamental issues, even such as where do people sleep, how do you feed them, how do you transport them around. The staff culture and skill set was actually one of the biggest determinants of whether an organisation did well. Was there a culture of empowerment? Did the organisation structure facilitate a quick response? Did the organisation structure facilitate dialogue and collaboration? There was a holistic view of risk. So risk wasn't a financial issue. It was actually a multifaceted view of risk, and it went throughout the whole supply chain and across many different functions. We found some amazing technology. Some of it's probably very proprietary. Some would put NASA's, I would say, mission control to shame. So it was pretty amazing what assets the private sector has to share in those respects. And maybe some of the panelists can talk about what they do. One of the important learnings was defining an asset. What is an asset? It's not just a manufacturing site. It's your staff. It's obviously your technology. It's also your relationships. It's your suppliers. So having a more holistic view around your assets. And then talking about suppliers, a lot of organisations, they talk about supplier risk management. They don't talk about supplier resilience, supplier dependence, even supplier security. So having a much more mature way of dealing with your suppliers. Maybe you can talk about that, Rudi, you mentioned earlier. Creating mutual partnerships. Walmart's not here today, but they have a great comment. They said if you're picking up the phone when a disaster's occurred, it's way too late. You know, you're way on the list of priorities of everyone. So you have to create proactive relationships. A number of organisations actually shared their assets. So when a disaster was to occur, how would they actually pool their assets? And they're not investing in redundant assets. So say, for example, if one organisation is investing in a fire department, the neighbouring organisation shouldn't do that. They should go and invest in something which is complementary. And then finally, they all went through an evolution of awareness. I don't think there's any organisation here that had the answer from day one, but they actually had a mechanism to learn from their experiences. So some major findings there. There's definitely a desire to share. There's definitely an understanding that public and private partnerships play a critical role into creating a resilient society and economy. And it's imperative that we all have a common vision to have this dialogue and to create this shared value. The intention of this session is to actually create a foundation for the HFA 2015. As mentioned earlier, to bring more participants into the dialogue, to have a voice into representing, first of all, the private sector, but also coming up with some, again, with some tangible actions and solutions. To quote you again, Aris, the great quotes. So with that, I shall hand it over to the panel. I'm going to, Rudi, you're to the left of me, so you're first. Okay. There's no particular order here, so we're randomly spread here, but you get to set the scene. Based on what you've heard, and your organisation's obviously been a big contributor, and you're very active, why don't you give us a view, what does creating shared value mean for Citigroup, and how does Citi become a resilient organisation?
Okay, so I guess let me start by saying the first thing is that I am your neighbour. I live in the same neighbourhood. I work and operate there. So the first and fundamental thing is that we're looking at is that we're not just a business operating in multiple locations. Yeah, I operate in over 100 countries. I have over 360,000 employees, but those people are your neighbors. They're part of the environment and fabric. So for us, creating an environment that not only we can conduct business, but we can also be part of the community. Because let's face it, when we have a situation, you mentioned the tsunami, and all of those are just lessons that we've learned along the way, because we've been involved in all of those, right? So, our employees are affected. The way we process our operational work is affected. And you talked about the suppliers. Yes, we also outsource. So that means, by extension, those suppliers are now part of our fabric, and our responsibility is to ensure that we can continue to process. So how do we do that? I think that we do that by viewing partnerships in 3 dimensions, right? There are 3 dimensions that we feel comfortable on building relationships. One is an advisory role, right? So, and that advisory role is broken down into 2 subsets, right? And I'll talk about those in a minute. And the third one is collaboration, because we also recognize that in situations like 9/11, or post 9/11, I should say, it is important that we have an integrated fabric, that it's not only public looking at the public safety and all of those things, but it's also that we are sharing information, both of how we're doing and how we can help each other during a crisis situation. So I'll talk a little bit about lessons learned there. But let me go back up to what advisory means, right? There's 2 kinds of things, right? We do this for a living, whether we like it or not, day in and day out. And so, yes, we have acquired, through lessons learned, through the way that we look at how we make our business resilient, we have subject matter experts, of which we can work with the public sector. I myself am here in Geneva, for example, because I'm doing work with the UN. Just this morning I was facilitating their crisis management exercise. And that is a long-term relationship that we've had from New York, as well as the World Food Program, UNICEF. And in that capacity, what we're doing is helping them create a framework that then they can institute in their organization so that they can address business continuity. They can address crisis management at a structure that we in the business side are used to operating in. So that's one dimension of advisory. I think the other dimension of advisory that we use is the actual helping the public sector with what we would call guidance and finding solutions with them so that they can be better at the emergency management financial aspects of it. So what am I mean by that? For example, in the past, I'll take an incident that occurred a while back in the Philippines with one of the typhoons, and we had actions against hunger. They had a large money that they had to distribute relatively quickly. So working with them and creating a solution where we had prepaid cards so that people can actually use that to purchase food during a disaster, right? Because the enemy here is, and it's an enemy for us too, is you're dealing with paper currency or whatever during a crisis. That becomes a challenging event, and we'll talk about that later, but that also creates an environment. So certainly creating that particular, we feel very comfortable in that. And yeah, you're right, we do interact with a number of agencies. Again, it's a bi-directional interest, right? I'm operating in your country, in your city, in your neighborhood, and I certainly need that support for different reasons, for my operational reasons, but doesn't mean that I'm not contributing to the community. A collaboration is where we have an integrated crisis management. We're part of that local crisis management that's dealing with a situation. I'll give you a quick example. On 9/11, we had in New York City a very structure where public sector didn't really talk to the private sector, and we kept to ourselves, basically. So 9/11 happens, and of that, what we quickly learned was the sharing of information was vital. Not only because we needed to, obviously, of the things that had occurred, and we were trying to get information of even our own staff that was implicated, but how did we evolve? How did we make sure that as we moved forward, we had a system that when Sandy or a blackout or tremendous storms that had implications on the markets. Are we going to close them? Are we going to open them? That we were interacting with each other. And at the same time, give the government agencies an opportunity to say, hey, listen, we don't want anybody on the roads because we have to do this. That's fine. Then we can take it and institute it within our own network frame and do that. And we were doing it as a community collectively, the private sector, which was, and by the way, I'm city, but I'm also talking from a greater financial structure. We were all collectively would be integrated with the city. And in today's environment, that was a model that we created back in post-2001, and it has been replicated throughout, at least in the U.S., which is a structure that we have in today's environment, not only at the major cities in New York, in the U.S., but also at the Treasury and the federal level. So there is that type of networking so that we can share information.
It's definitely food for thought. So, and some great examples there. And I think you'll get some questions from the audience for a bit more.
Maybe I'll be leaving with the permit.
Yeah. Lilian, as you mentioned, the government of the Netherlands has a real interest in this area, particularly in infrastructure investment. Why don't you take us through some of your experiences and how you guys tackle this problem
Will do. Thank you so much. Let me start by saying that the business case that I'm going to make about how to create shared value is about public-private partnerships. And it might sound like, this is the solution that we've come up with, but you also need to know that there's not one solution, and this way of working, which proves to be very effective, is also the result of the Dutch struggling and working with the risk of flooding for centuries. So it might sound like, this is the way to go, and I do think it is in these times. But you should also know that it's also building on past experiences and improving as we go. Public-private partnerships is basically, if you look at the way the Dutch government is approaching the risks that we have to manage in terms of us being a delta. This is at the heart of things. The whole attitude towards risk management has been very much near to our heart. It's become a second nature. It's been in our DNA. So I'm not going to speak to you about how we are doing our risk assessments. We are risk assessment, basically. But what we've been doing in mitigating the risk and working on the risk in terms of how we design our infrastructure around mitigating those risks. And we learned that working in public-private partnerships is one of the best ways to address these infrastructural projects like sluices and dikes and ports and what have you to work with the risk. And why is a public partnership, why do they prove to be so effective? For a couple of reasons. First of all, and I'm talking about, this is when it works out well. Sometimes something goes wrong. There might be Dutch in the room who are going to challenge me on this one, but this is when it all works out well. When it all works out well, it's basically the best of both worlds. Public sector, private sector working together. In the Netherlands, that also means that civil society is engaged and that we do it in the framework of the democracy that we are. Even at a very local level, we have water boards where local communities are engaged, elect their representatives to be part of the whole setup of how we are going to deal with these infrastructural projects. So it's within a democratic framework, and it gives an opportunity to use the innovative power and energy that the private sector can give to us. And it also is a way of engaging financial resources into our infrastructural project that we would, as a government, not be able to put into that. So we're creating added value, I would say, by making transparent and democratic processes as the way to go, by inviting the private sector and their innovative ideas and energy to contribute to the programs. And we are also able to engage more financial resources from private sector than we would have been able to do when we would do it on our own. Now, how could it work? Because it can be very complicated because you need different actors. You need actors from financial sector, so the large banks and finance institutions need to be engaged. You need engineering companies. I mean, as we are sitting here, I think we have all the points of view that we need. And one needs to have a clear view on how the project and the contracts need to be designed. They need to be sustainable. They need to be in accordance with all kinds of ILO and USO of OECD standards. They need to be environmentally sound. Otherwise, I mean, this is how democracy works. The Dutch people will not accept it. I'm looking at my left eye, and you agree. We need to have a long-term commitment on these programs from the private sector and the public sector. Now, it has been working well in the Netherlands, and could this model, whereby you engage so many actors and tap into their strength, basically, could it also work in different contexts? And the answer, I would say, is yes, but it does need some work. And looking at, the international perspectives that are in the room, I'm really looking forward to your comments on this. If you look, and I'm going to give you an example from Thailand and Indonesia, where also at a local level, people are really making risk assessments. Local farmers are coming to the conclusion that when the water management is not up to standards, it will affect their produce. So they team up with industries, with other farmers, with property owners, and they invest locally in flood measures, thereby reducing the high cost of flooding. Now, this is small-scale public-private partnerships, but it needs to be scaled up. Other investors, larger investors like Citigroup or the World Bank, need to come in. Larger companies need to see the opportunities for investment. And the government, for example, of Indonesia has to be aware of the role that they can play, and they are. So together with us, they have set up an office which is called the Jakarta Flood Protection Office. So it needs, from the local to the national level, it needs all the different players to be engaged. But then it can work very, very well. It can be sustainable. It's not a one-time shot. It's not the responsibility only from the private sector, from the public sector. It's not only a way to make profit from the private sector. I mean, you're allowed to, but let's engage. And this is a way in which we think we can work with the outcome of risk assessment to work on more sustainable solutions. So we're really strongly advocating for that. And I need to leave at 6, as was mentioned earlier, but I'm sure that my colleagues from our embassy and others will be very happy to talk to you about how that can work in your context. And we are really willing and able to share our experiences.
Thanks, Lilian. I think there are a number of messages there that really resonate with everyone, especially around bringing a cross-section of actors and making these investments sustainable. Jan, it's a great segue. That was a very Dutch perspective, and I've worked with a lot of Dutch people before, so I know they're straight to the point and get things done. Not all governments or organisations are like that. Being the global head of PwC for public sector, I'm sure you have some interesting experiences. In the interest of time, if we can all, I hate to ask for this, but if we can speed things up so we can then loop it into the Q&A, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest.
Absolutely. Thank you, Os. Well, there's a lot of improvement that can be made, and I will comment to say that giving some general experiences and learnings from our side. Number one is you don't need to be a prophet for saying that we need in disruptive futures or uncertainty 3.0, which means we have to focus on preparedness and mitigation, so we are better off. I think there's a huge opportunity cost if we don't get engaged. I think that's the best political argument to put on the table. What will happen if we do not do anything? That is a way of structuring, I think, the debate. Also, I think we have to be prepared on all kind of levels. It's strategic, it's operational, it's mental, technological, logistically, but also on a personal level. And without the personal level, forget it. And then it's about the global level and the local. So we try, from PwC point of view, create a global perspective, because as we heard, we are everywhere, but we are very engaged in different cities, in different countries, very locally. I think that is a good thing. Let me also say that I think the mission for us all is to try to create a local collaboratory around the globe with strong leadership and a strong vision for the future, a strong passion for people and compassion, but it's also about a mission to fix it together. private sector, public sector, and not-for-profit sector. I think they're having a huge, a rapid growth of both innovation, social innovation, and other things into this very holistic approach, cross sectors, cross industries, cross everything, basically, to be Dutch. Yes. So we need also, finally, in this first comment, a very caring and serving leadership who create meaning, sense of belonging, because it's so hard when things happen. So I think the servant leadership approach into these processes are absolutely a key. So let me conclude, say, we need to build social and intellectual capital through these networks. You should not underestimate intellectual capital. Open data, open source, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, you name it, it's a fantastic opportunity. Ensure collaboration also across state, region, and local, because that's another dimension which sometimes is really weird. And provide incentives for resilient recovery. From these 3 layers of government coming together and saying, well, we see the problem, let's fix it. Access to private finance, the finance from private sector, and maybe also, I would say, motivate local participation, because there's a strong energy on the ground. Before it happens, and then if it happens, people are, that. We've been through it, tsunami, Katrina, Sandy, etc., you name it, but it's amazing. It's truly amazing. And finally, work hard on the insurance side as well, because that is also a great opportunity for improvement, I would say. So if we consider the insurance management process as a need for a process being continuously improved, we will save a lot of money. Because if you have the dialogue with the insurance companies, we will figure out that they really like you, love you, if you do new things. So with those things, I would say, final comment, there are, when we work across industry sectors and different levels of government, we see the need for change of how do we create and design or redesign the innovation ecosystem. And the eco is much more than a system, the ecosystem. So I think this area is truly a good area to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Sometimes I wish I had to drink, because you always bring a lot of passion and excitement to this topic. Your last comment on innovation, I think that's probably one of the key messages. If public-private partnerships are done well, it not only makes organizations and governments more resilient, but it also brings innovation, and it will be great to hear a bit more about that. Christian, Nestle. Now, Nestle has global reach, as we all know, involved in feeding people, distributing water. So I'm sure this is something that comes across your desk, as you say, every day in some form or fashion. And you're probably experienced in it, so it'd be great for you to share your experiences, how Nestle went on that journey of driving shared value or creating shared value.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I said earlier, we have integrated this shared value creation into our business model. The business model is public. It's our firm conviction that we as a company can only be successful in the long term if the societies and the communities in which we work are successful as well. It's simple and straightforward. It's on a one A4 page in our annual report, so we can look at it together with the more competitive issues like the different growth drivers. But this notion of creating shared value in the long term is at the heart of the business strategy. The company has been around for about 150 years. We always say we want to be around for another 150 years. And we are firmly rooted in the communities globally in which we work. When we say shared value creation, we mean shared value creation in areas which are close to our business, of course, because this is where we have our expertise. This is where we can create an added value for society. And these 3 areas, we are the world's biggest food and beverage company. Those 3 areas are nutrition, water, and rural development. As Oz said, we have a large presence. We have globally 470 factories. Half of those factories are in developing countries, and 73% of those factories are actually in rural areas. We have roughly 340,000 employees all over the globe. Yes, we have our internal resilience. We have our enterprise risk management system implemented at all levels. We have the necessary insurance coverage. We have contingency planning. And one of our strengths in terms of disaster resilience is also this very local presence. So we are a company which sources locally, processes locally, and markets locally. There are only two commodities which actually travel within the company, and that's coffee and cocoa. All the rest is local. So this local and regional presence helps us, of course, in terms of risk anticipation and then business continuity. But then if we go into our supply chain, this is where the big challenge is start. So we have only, to give you a flavor, we have 167,000 first-tier suppliers. So that's only the first-tier suppliers. Apple has maybe 100. We have 167,000. Then if we move upstream, of course, the numbers get multiplied. We work directly with roughly 700,000 farmers with whom we have long-term relationships. But then indirect sourcing comes from 6 to 7 million farmers. So if we want to build a resilient agricultural supply chain, at the end of the day, we're producing food, and food comes from agriculture. We have to build resilience into these farming systems. So we work in milk districts on well protection, manure management, a huge problem in many countries, even very advanced countries quite often. Drought-resistant crops, flood protection, irrigation techniques. Innovation is key. We have a partnership ongoing right now in Vietnam together with the Swiss Development Agency. Just looking at irrigation and with making small adjustments, you could potentially save gigantic quantities of waters, equaling the entire drinking water consumption of the country. So just by making small adaptations in the irrigation, in coffee, in that country. Then looking downstream as well. We're a food company. People have to eat at all time, in good times and bad times. So we have to ensure that what we produce gets to the consumers. And there we work with distributors, with retailers, with up to the mom and pop stores, so that the products are actually accessible for the consumers. Then when we look at relief and recovery, when things have gone wrong, when there is a disaster, we do have a global partnership with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, with whom we work at global level, but also with national Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies on the ground. But then we also have, of course, our operations on site. Just one example, Pakistan a few years ago, big floods. We had these massive fleets of 120 milk tankers, which could be transformed into water tankers, and we lent some of them to local authorities to actually provide relief. But then we had a project ongoing in the milk district with farmers, local authorities, and international relief organizations to recuperate the farmland, which was flooded, recuperate the wells, vaccinate the cattle. We've vaccinated hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cattle, keep the cattle while the farmers rebuild their livelihoods, and then invest in the recovery of those livelihoods together with local authorities and other actors. So you can go very far as a company, and you have to go very far as a company if you want to secure your long-term sustainable supply chain. And for us, yes, successful communities equals a successful business. To come back to the report, I firmly believe, and we firmly believe, that there are opportunities for partnerships at all three levels, which you've identified in the report in terms of understanding disaster risks. cooperation with authorities at local and national level in terms of understanding the risks, mapping, communication, awareness of where things could happen. Then in the response, obviously, the contacts always have to be established previously. It's very difficult, as you said, to call up somebody in the middle of an emergency and start building a relationship. That generally doesn't work very well. And then finally, in the area of an enabling environment, and again, that enabling environment across sectors has to be created beforehand, before the emergency, so it can be leveraged throughout the emergency and then in the recovery and reconstruction phase. So I'd leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Some great examples, especially the Pakistan cattle example. I think it's a fascinating example of building resilience in your complete supply chain. Mr. Roscoe, ABB were part of our study, and there were some fascinating, I guess, mechanisms that your organisation put in place to create behaviours of resilience, and also some fantastic pieces of technology. Do you want to give us some insights and what drove ABB down that path?
Sure. First of all, I'll just look at what I believe is our contribution to a more resilient society. And I don't see this as philanthropy. I don't see it as anything other than our day job, because much of our business is helping customers become more resilient. So public, private sector utilities and industries. Best practice in Japan, we heard in the open session, is integrating renewables, energy efficiency in smart grids to enable a level of redundancy and resilience when you are building cities for the future. That quite simply is what we do day to day and how we work with our customers day to day. City of San Francisco talked about a requirement to have a redundant power supply because they were too dependent on one pipe taking, I guess, either gas or electricity into the city. So we would be very interested in talking to them about their second option, the cable across the bay. We have some experience. We connect Norway and the Netherlands, the largest high-power underwater link. That takes hydropower into the Netherlands for ensuring that they don't have to spin their assets, their coal-fired assets, needlessly. We're also connecting wind farms in the North Sea. So for me, this is not something I have to jump out of my skin to think about. It's core to disaster resilience work, and I believe also it's happening at the right time. The lights are still on, and if the investment continues and there is a public-private understanding that these investments need to be made, then the lights are likely to stay on longer. What of our own DRR approach? Well, we have ERM, as many companies of our size and scope. That's top-down, bottom-up, so we're capturing all of the nightmares that keep people awake at night throughout the organisation. Then we look at the risks and we either mitigate them. Most of them we try to mitigate because they may be to do with a factory, and the choice is move the factory or mitigate the risk. Some are avoided, very few. They would tend to be perhaps geopolitical risks, countries we choose to operate in or not, and some of those risks we share. And I think what Oz was talking about in terms of our technology, my R&D colleagues would go absolutely mad with me if I paraded this as ABB's, major technology, because it's an iPad app. I want to take you past that amazing concept of an iPad app.
Everyone has an app these days.
Everyone has an app, yes. What the app does is it gives our senior managers access to critical insurance and risk management information at the tap of an iPad, and it covers some 250 of our roughly 350 factories around the world. it gives data in terms of the loss assessor or the insurance assessor's report on each individual factory and each individual risk. And then it gets clever and it starts to drive behaviour because as we self-insure, we charge the factories a premium. So those with a poor rating pay 25% more, and all the way up to an excellent rating, they get a 50% discount. No factory can have an excellent rating if it still has improvements, low-cost improvements on the book. So each factory also is required since 2002 to have a business continuity plan. So what can we see in terms of behaviour? Well, 99% of low-cost actions are completed within 90 days, so that gets them their discount. And 83 sites, incidentally, improve their water supply. One of the major risks in our business is fire. So the app also shows superimposed on a Google map that you can zoom in and out of, an overlay of Munich Re's natural hazard index. So we can again see that the factories are sitting on a storm surge area or seismic activity, and take whatever necessary crisis management actions that we require to take. It also shows us when there are other factories within ABB that make this stuff that we can transfer manufacture to. So it gives a very clear picture. The fact senior managers can see it drives behaviour to reduce the risks, the consequences, and to work on redundancies. So the app is driving behaviour. And I'm pleased that it's a behavioural thing as well as a technology thing.
Thank you, Adam. A fantastic example. I think it really hits home that the private sector is great in initiating change when there's something to measure. And there's nothing like a performance measure to drive cultural change. And that's one of the areas that we can learn from. I'm going to open it up for questions. As the moderator, I have the pleasure of asking the first question. Before I do that, how many people in this room are from the private sector? If you can just put your hands up. Oh, okay, so it's a good mix. That's a very good mix. Fantastic. Yeah. Where were you in the morning? You're hiding. It's a late start. So I'm going to ask my first question to yourself, Lilian. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of private sector folk in the room. From your experiences, what do you see as the success factors in actually getting the private sector to participate in the public-private discussion, whether it's making investments or building resilience? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, the Netherlands is a very small country, so you always bump into each other.
On your bikes, on your bikes.
Yeah, on your bikes, yeah. Well, I think one of the key success factors is that by partnering up, there's also something to gain for the private sector, not only in terms of financial gain, but also in I think the public partnerships, they really are kind of enforcing innovation. For example, one of the newer ideas that have come up is when looking at resilience and building infrastructure for resilience, you can build a dike, okay, but you can also use the dike to build a parking lot on it, which is, I mean, not so much an idea that would come out of the private sector or the public sector, but when you sit together and you go through the program and you look how to finance it, how to make it sustainable, how to make it work for the community, then you come up with those ideas. So I think the drive for innovation or the opportunity for innovation that then also can be used in other contexts would be really an incentive.
Yes, I think mutual gain is definitely one of the key factors we hear quite often. So I'm going to open up to the floor. It's always a dangerous prospect. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to ask for 3 questions, and then I will hand them out to whoever feels fit to answer them. May I please remind you that a question is a question, not a statement. So please be prompt in your question, and then let's see if we can get the panel here to contribute. So I'll ask for a group of 3, and then we'll take it from there. At the front here, please.
Merci. Tout d'abord, je voudrais poser une question portant sur le PPP, le partenariat du secteur public et privé, quoi. Surtout le modèle des Pays-Bas que vous avez appliqué depuis un siècle et demi. Je pense que ça devient la tradition. Est-ce que je pourrais partager quel est le modèle, la participation vivement du secteur public et celui du privé? Quelle est la combinaison? Est-ce que le secteur public joue le rôle sur l'établissement de la loi, etc. Voilà, merci.
Around the models being used in the Netherlands and how it's being... Two more questions, please. Over there, just yep. The man with the red tie, go ahead, yes. How do we get the... over here? Just at the second... oh, okay, well, fine. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Nickisch. I'm representing the United Religions Initiative here in Geneva. And my question is regarding the practice of sharing best practices amongst governments, and if there's a similar practice amongst the corporate world where there's a very strong competitive market, which we understand, but maybe some solutions which are not so sensitive regarding R&D and development or the like. I would like to hear that.
That's a great question. And there was a gentleman here too. Can you stand up, please, so they can get you the microphone? It's much easier if you stand up. Because there's many men wearing red ties in this room, including myself.
Yeah, I'm Victor Rembet. I'm from Disaster Resource Partnership, construction and engineering companies in Indonesia. And then actually what I would like to see, because apparently, thank you for all your presentations. The panelists, you're from the MNC, the multinational companies that I'm sure CT and all Nestle and ABB, you have your office in Indonesia. And this is what we would like. Indonesia as the second, according to global assessment, this is including you, ministers of Netherlands, because you mentioned Indonesia several times. How could you encourage the companies in Indonesia or anywhere else to be involved? Because I agree with Mr. Roscoe that you are doing this. I mean, this is not just DRRs as business as usual, because private sectors is a donor organizations. You are not giving money, but you are providing things on reducing the risk, and then even securing the profits is something that you. So how could you encourage or engage your companies in 100 something countries to be involved? Not just, I mean, this shared value, just to going down into relevant countries that are prone to disasters, and also especially for the 2 questions, could I? because he mentions about Indonesia. Yeah, I think the good the good practice that you are trying to do in Netherlands, I think you should also encourage the public-private partnerships that you are doing in Netherlands, because we have a very, very close relationship emotionally and socially between Netherlands and Indonesia, and or you could do that in anywhere else that you have international development aid. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question on the models in Netherlands. I'm not going to pass that to Adam. I'll pass that to you, Lilian. And then we have two other questions on sharing best practices from the private sector, and then also how to drive that within Indonesia and maybe take some of those models. So, Lilian, over to you for the first question.
Thank you so much. Well, it's actually a true cooperative model. How does it work, was your question on public-private partnerships. Obviously, the government is the one to take the lead in identifying the issue or identifying the necessity of an infrastructural enhancement as it occurs. But as a government, we really want to work together, starting from the design phase. So we would invite the private sector and also sometimes the financial sector to sit at one of the first phases in the program to think about what would be a good design and come up with innovative solutions for that. When you look at the next phase where the program has been finalized, and obviously there's issues on operation and maintenance, then in the model, the operation and maintenance would be done by the private sector, thus also freeing government resources, but the government would pay for the use. So it's not like the government tenders and then sits back and leaves it to the private sector to deal with it. We continually stay engaged with the private sector as we move on to the operational and maintenance phase. So it's a true partnership. It's not only working together in a certain phase, but it's a true partnership based obviously on, well, democratic control and contracts between the different partners. Should I also address the... Yeah, because then, yeah, thank you so much for bringing in the special relationship that there is between Indonesia and the Netherlands. I would say that it doesn't need this strong and historical ties as our countries has, but it does need a relationship that's there to stay. I mean, working on public-private partnerships and inviting governments or private companies from abroad is not a one-time shot. From both perspectives, one needs to be willing to invest in a longer-term relationship. Now, the Netherlands government is now working from a development perspective with 15 countries, and those relationships we've been building for many, many years. And even then it can be a challenge, obviously. But I do think also in the Netherlands, working with private companies, it's not a one-time shot. We like to invest in the relationships, because also when the going gets rough, one needs to know how to deal with each other. So yeah, investing in relationship is key, I think.
And I think your message is one size doesn't fit all. It's quite important too. Even if it's the private sector, every organisation has different values. There was a question, a great question there from the middle of the room with respect to how do we get the private sector to share some of these great experiences, some of that non-proprietary technology or processes. From the, thank you. From the private sector here, we've got Nestle, ABB, Rudi. Who'd like to volunteer for that? It's Christian? Okay, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I start. Two things. One, best practice sharing, of course, extremely important, also with other businesses. Slightly tricky within the same sector, because very quickly you're into antitrust issues. So there are pre-competitive initiatives. There is one on sustainable agriculture, for example, of major food and beverage producers and retailers on a pre-competitive basis, exchanging best agricultural practices. So that is one option. Another option, which is often underestimated, is actually the convening capacity of the UN Global Compact, which is a private sector forum within the UN. local networks, very strong ones in Indonesia, for example. The Indonesian network has a strong focus on water and water stewardship. And so there are platforms which can bring different sectors together and work on specific issues. So these just two points. So maybe my colleagues have other.
Rudi, over to you. Your views?
Yeah, let me talk about that, because from a financial institution perspective, we do actually have a number of associations that we share we share best practices, especially when we're dealing about our staff issues that we are all facing, like, for example, pandemic or regulatory changes. Those are items that we will share. What are people doing? Obviously, there's always a competitiveness within our own organizations, but I think that we look at that across the landscape and look at, how is everybody doing? Because at the end of the day, it's a double-edged sword. We're also clients and business partners in that network and framework as well. So we look at it in different dimensions.
There was a second part to the gentleman's question there from Indonesia in localizing the vision that your headquarters may have. Adam, you may want to talk a little bit about that, because it is very different to say one thing at headquarters and then actually make it reality in the country.
Yeah, that's the holy grail, I guess. No, I think from our perspective, just talking about capacity building, for example, in Indonesia, we would seek ways to get involved with technical colleges that produce the engineers that we will need to have a sustainable business. We will look at supplier resilience, which again is very important to the continuity of our business. So this is completely enlightened self-interest. In terms of one size does not fit all. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, now I have to go back to my office and I have to operationalize what I've heard today. And, who do I speak to, or who do I suggest my respective 40 active country managers speak to in the various public sector organizations that are going to make a difference? So, we may have to help from headquarters in terms of throwing a bit of a framework around stakeholder mapping and engagement processes on this topic.
It's a bit like herding cats, Adam. I'm going to open it up for 3 more questions. I think we're doing really good for time. It always helps to have a Swiss-based moderator. We've got 15 minutes, which should be ample time. Before I ask for the next 3 questions, I should add that the UNISDR Private Sector Advisory Group actually has a whole library of best practices, and the UNISDR have a lot of open source information that there is not just for the private sector to leverage, but also for the public sector. So I think some of the challenges here is knowing what is actually available. So let me go to a question from the front. Again, if you can.
Hello, my name is Kate Crowley. I work for CAFOD, which is an international NGO. And we have been chatting to Aon Benfield Reinsurance to see if we can link with them in terms of knowledge sharing and coming together with the private sector. We think it's really important that we do this. But from your experience, I wanted to know, what is the top challenge in engaging with the INGOs? Because if we know the challenges, then maybe we can go some way to overcome them. Thank you.
Okay, yep, that's a common question. How to engage the NGOs successfully, and everyone has a role. Question in the middle, if you can stand up, sir, just so the microphone can get to you. And there's a question right at the back there, if you can.
Thank you very much. My name is Abiy Hailu. I come from IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development East Africa. Just I heard all very, very nice thoughts, reflections, and sharing of experience from the private sector, which is very interesting, and thank you for all that contribution. But there is also another dimension to the private sector. Private sector is not always investing in resilience, but the private sector actions could also lead to hazards and disasters. One which is still fresh in our memory is the building collapse in Bangladesh. But now, of course, we are generally short in memory, but if you went back a bit to this financial meltdown, although I don't know where to put it as a disaster or not, but it has had disastrous consequences, and we are still reeling from the consequences of the financial meltdown, and much of it is also has been provoked by the private sector. My question is not to put some kind of a statement or to put blame on this or that, but how can we how can we design a system in such a way that everyone does what it needs to do in the best interest of all of us, the community, the business interest, and sustainability. We have got also to keep this world going for the next generation and several generations to follow.
Okay, so I think there's a question there around the resilient investments from the private sector and not turning a blind eye to potential impacts. I won't address the corporate financial crisis because I know Rudi's here next to me, but I know he's not a banker and I'm not a banker, so I don't have any answers there. We'll focus on natural disasters, but we'll come back to that question on private sector investing in resilience. And there was one last question at the back.
Thank you. Actually, the former speaker already posed my question partly. My name is Marie-José Vervest. I work for Wetlands International, and we are part of a partnership which is called Partners for Resilience. We promote an integrated approach to disaster risk reduction, integrating climate change and ecosystem approaches in overall DRR. My question is the following. We are trying to develop a business case for our DRR work since some time already, but it has proven to be very difficult because we do work in those areas which are highly disaster prone with very vulnerable people who are in many cases not part of the national economy, and farmers which might not be the suppliers for Nestle, or people who are not big consumers. So my question is, how can we develop a business case? We have tried already with the insurance sector, with some corporates, but it's proven to be very difficult. For working on disaster risk reduction for those people who are the most vulnerable, because they don't have any other options, the poorest of the poor, how can we still get the interest of the private sector and also the public sector for DRR work with for those people?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have 3 questions. One on how do we incorporate the efforts made by NGOs in knowledge sharing and tackling this challenge. There's a second question on the private sector investing in resilience, especially in developing economies. And a third one as to how do we actually involve the people at the grassroots level, not just the big corporations or the larger local organizations, but the communities and the people who can't necessarily afford this. So who wants to take the NGO question? why don't you go ahead, Rudi, and then...
Well, I think that in working with NGOs, and in some cases, the whole structure is inefficient. So I think that there's certainly an opportunity to working with the financial side of the houses to make it a little bit more efficient, less dependent on paper or transactional, things that will definitely, during a crisis situation or an event, will make it more difficult. So putting more electronic banking, for example, into the overall mixture of how you operate, putting more efficiency over the supplier chain, and how do you secure procurement and activities. Certainly those are solutions that financial institutions can certainly help, in that relationship.
Adam, did you want a quick comment?
Yeah, just a very quick one. We have a number of relationships with NGOs, and I think that initiation of those relationships must be based on a shared common value or values. I think then you have sort of more commitment than you're necessarily paying for. The other thing is, I think, to echo what Rudi said, make it easy for the business to do business with you. We have to report in minute detail to regulators, and if our accounts are not sufficient from the NGO, the easiest thing for us to do is just forget it, don't do it anymore.
Yeah, Jan, you may have a comment around that, especially working for a lot of the governments and communities. How do you get a number of these actors
well, I think that there are
talking the same language?
Two comments maybe. One is to increase the level of professionalism, as you're alluding to as well. I think that's a key. And another thing I think is to get engaged from the INGOs with the governments on the spot, so to speak. The territories, lowest level is the cities. And I would say the cities has a specific responsibility in this type of processes, because they also, in a sense, own the innovation ecosystem, linked to universities, schools, private sector business, small ones, big ones, NGOs. And then the question is, do we have processes? Do they have arenas? Do they have define the issues together? And have they been engaged and invited to take place in the process? If not, I think we should knock the door and say, well, can we come in here and support and serve and help? So I think it's a great need for I would say, a bigger dialogue. And I think there's a lot of, I would call it, new capitals, social capital, intellectual capital, innovation capital, and not capital of trust, because the NGO creates a certain trust within the local communities. So that kind of capital, I would call it the new capitalism. It's an enabler when we think about how do we develop future of reduce disastrous risks and so on. Finally, let me say, talking about benchmarking, that's great, but maybe it's even better to think about not only best practice, but think about best option. Best practice tends to lead to mediocrity. Best option tends to lead to innovation.
It's a very good comment, Jan. There's a very important question there around investing in resilience by the private sector. Now, there's an interesting finding in the GAR that some of the challenges in this this is a double-edged sword. Governments promote investment in certain areas which there shouldn't be any investment, or should be mitigated. Alternatively, organisations not following standards or regulations. It'd be interesting to hear from some of the panelists' views. Maybe Christian, you feel comfortable? We can kick it off, but I think it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not something that the private sector is going to solve.
Yes, and actually there are areas, and I think that leads to the last question. If I understand right, I get landed with difficult questions. The easy one, but The last question on what you do about people and areas which are not necessarily on the radar and who seem to be falling between the cracks, and that's a very important one. And when you look at this from a pure risk perspective, as a company, you actually may want to disengage. And this is where we need organizations like yours and others to tell us, look, it is important to engage. Like the environment organizations who tell us, don't just walk away when there is high water scarcity in a country. We want you to invest. We want you to make sure that there are rural livelihoods. So we want you to be there, but behave responsibly. And this leads to the other question of the gentleman from East Africa, which is a very good question, is companies, and I have a very strong view about this personally, companies before starting to think of how they can do good, they have to ensure that they don't do harm. And that's the basic premise. But that's the premise which is underlying that discussion we were having today. Before creating shared value, you have to make sure that you're compliant with national law and international standards, that your activities are environmentally and socially sustainable. And yes, then you engage beyond. And this is also when governments should have their thresholds of engaging.
Some great insights, Christian. Rudi, you seemed eager to respond to. So just quickly, we were running out of time. We've got about 4 minutes. So.
Yeah, I'm going to respond because I think I'm going to echo one of the colleagues of mine that spoke last week in New York, and I think that. We talk about investment, but government also has a role to play here on ensuring standards, our infrastructure standards, especially urban standards, are very well laid out, also enforced, which then lends itself to a better investment of the dollar. So I think it's not a one. It's just it's a bi-directional thing here, right? And that's where we can avoid issues like what happened in Bangladesh. The other thing is that there are also, and Jan had mentioned insurance, but there are also other vehicles for what we call self-investment to ensure that reconstruction occurs. In an environment where, let's face it, the financial crisis is something that obviously it impacts from a global basis, but there are steps that you can be doing in partnership with the financial side of the house to come up with vehicles that will enable you to have some bonds or some issues that also protect yourself for reconstruction. You might want to jump in there.
I fully agree. And 1 minute, yes. And I would say there's a trend of smart cities around the globe. Sometimes it's called smart cities and smart citization, whatever we would like. I think it's time to connect the silos of smart cities in a broader context and integrate that also to the topic of reduce disaster risk, because they are living separate lives today. And I think there's a huge opportunity, not least through procurement department, when we do these kind of big projects with technology providers, this should be embedded in a completely new way, in a holistic approach.
I'm going to close out the session. I hope all of you have enjoyed the discussion. I think it's been very insightful. I think the fact that we have so many private sector people in the audience, we've got such great companies, we're going to see more and more of this. Is there any last words that each of you would like to leave? No, I think we've got our messages across. Thank you very much. We're going to be out there with the Swiss wine and cheese, and I appreciate your attendance.